Welcome to this journey into one of the most disturbing and tragic cases to emerge from the American South in the 19th century. Before we begin, I want to know where you are right now as you listen to this story. Tell me in the comments what time it is where you are and whether you're listening alone or with someone. This community thrives on your presence, and I read every single comment. Tonight, we travel to Georgia in the year 1879, to a time when the wounds of the Civil War were still fresh, when isolation could drive people to unthinkable acts, and when love itself could become something monstrous. This is the story of Thomas and Margaret Holloway, brother and sister, lovers, and eventually bride and groom in a ceremony that should never have taken place. In the spring of 1886, Sheriff Coleman Wade of Chatham County received an anonymous letter that would lead him to one of the most horrifying discoveries in Georgia's criminal history. The letter was brief, written in shaking handwriting, and it said only this: "The Holloway farm, the locked room upstairs, God have mercy on us all." When Sheriff Wade and 3 deputies arrived at the decaying Holloway property on a grey April morning, they found the main house in a state of advanced deterioration. The once grand plantation home, built before the war, was now a skeleton of its former self. Shutters hung loose, paint peeled in long strips, and an almost sweet smell hung in the air, a smell that made the deputies cover their mouths with handkerchiefs. Thomas Holloway, age 35, met them at the door. Witnesses described him as gaunt, with hollow eyes, and the appearance of a man who had not slept in months. He did not resist. He did not ask why they had come. He simply stepped aside and said, in a voice barely above a whisper, "She's upstairs. She's been waiting." What Sheriff Wade found in that locked second-floor bedroom would become the subject of newspaper reports across the nation, medical inquiries, and whispered legends that persist to this day. The room was arranged as a bridal chamber. White fabric, yellowed with age, draped the walls. Candles, burned down to stubs, covered every surface, and on the bed, arranged in a white wedding dress that had been meticulously maintained, lay the body of Margaret Holloway. She had been dead for 7 years. But this was not a simple case of a man unable to let go of his sister. What the investigators discovered in the following days revealed a relationship that had violated every law of God and man. A ritual marriage performed over a corpse, and evidence of practices so disturbing that portions of the official report were sealed for decades. This is the story of the flesh marriage, a story of obsession, forbidden love, death, and the hollow vows spoken in darkness. And I must warn you now, this story does not have a clean ending. Thomas Holloway vanished before he could be brought to trial. His body was never found. And even now, more than a century later, people who visit the ruins of the Holloway farm report hearing voices in the darkness, whispering words that sound like wedding vows. Stay with me. This journey will be long, disturbing, and will leave you with questions that may never be answered. To understand what happened at the Holloway farm, we must first understand the world that created Thomas and Margaret Holloway. The year 1879 was a time of profound transformation in the American South. The Civil War had ended 14 years earlier, but its scars remained deep. The plantation economy had collapsed. Families that had once commanded wealth and respect now struggled to maintain their ancestral lands. Many properties fell into ruin, their owners unable to afford the labor that had once been provided by enslaved people. The Holloway family had once been prosperous. Their plantation, located approximately 15 miles southwest of Savannah, had produced cotton and timber before the war. But Jeremiah Holloway, the patriarch, had died at the Battle of Chickamauga in 1863. His wife, Clara, died of influenza 2 years later. This left their 2 children, Thomas and Margaret, alone in a world that no longer had a place for them. Thomas had been 20 years old when the war ended. He had served briefly in the Confederate Army, but had been sent home due to a lung ailment. Margaret, 4 years younger, had never left the property. She had been educated at home by her mother, taught to read, to play piano, and to maintain a household. But she had never been to Savannah. She had never attended a social gathering. She had lived her entire life within the boundaries of the Holloway land. Contemporary accounts describe the Holloway siblings as reclusive, even by the standards of isolated rural families. A neighboring farmer, Samuel Pritchett, later testified that he had encountered Thomas in town perhaps twice a year, always alone, always purchasing supplies in silence, before disappearing back to the farm. Margaret was never seen at all. When asked about his sister, Thomas would simply say that she was delicate and preferred privacy. But there were whispers. In small communities, there are always whispers. A letter written in 1877 by Abigail Pritchett, Samuel's wife, to her sister in Charleston, provides our first documented hint of something unnatural at the Holloway farm. The letter, discovered in a private collection in 1934, reads in part, "There is something wrong at the Holloway place. Samuel saw them together by the creek last month, and he says they were holding hands like sweethearts, not like brother and sister. When I asked him what he meant, he would not speak more of it, but I could see it troubled him greatly." In the strict moral framework of the post-war South, incest was not merely a crime, it was an abomination, a sin that marked a family as cursed. If such a relationship existed between Thomas and Margaret, they would have had every reason to hide it, to withdraw from society entirely. The Holloway property itself contributed to their isolation. The main house stood at the end of a long dirt road surrounded by oak trees draped with Spanish moss. The nearest neighbor was the Pritchett farm, more than a mile away. The land had gone largely uncultivated since the war, reverting to wilderness. It was a place where secrets could be kept, where the outside world could be forgotten entirely. In the autumn of 1879, Margaret Holloway fell ill. The exact nature of her illness remains unclear. No doctor was summoned. No one outside the property knew she was dying. Years later, when Thomas's diaries were examined, he described her symptoms: high fever, delirium, an inability to eat or drink. Medical experts who reviewed these descriptions have suggested typhoid fever, though no definitive diagnosis can be made. Margaret died on October 12, 1879, at the age of 24. She should have been buried in the family cemetery on the property, a small plot surrounded by an iron fence where her parents and 2 infant siblings rested. A death should have been reported to the county. A funeral should have been held. None of this happened. Instead, Thomas Holloway began a ritual that would consume the next 7 years of his life and ultimately destroy what remained of his sanity. He would not let her go. He could not let her go, because in his mind, their story was not over. In his mind, they had made promises to each other, vows that transcended death itself, and so he prepared her body. He dressed her in a wedding gown that had belonged to their mother. He moved her to the best bedroom in the house, arranged her on the bed, surrounded her with candles and flowers that he replaced weekly with fresh blooms from the overgrown garden. And then, in a ceremony witnessed only by shadows and candlelight, Thomas Holloway married his dead sister. The details of this ceremony would later be found in his diaries, written in increasingly erratic handwriting, filled with biblical passages, occult symbols, and expressions of a love so absolute that it could not accept the finality of death. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. To understand the full horror of what occurred, we must proceed slowly, carefully, examining each piece of evidence as it was discovered. Because what happened at the Holloway farm was not simply a case of a disturbed man keeping his sister's body, it was something far more complex, far more disturbing and far more tragic than anyone could have imagined. The first indication that something was profoundly wrong at the Holloway farm came not from official sources, but from the observations of common people who lived nearby and noticed changes they could not explain. In November of 1879, just 1 month after Margaret's death, Samuel Pritchett recorded in his personal ledger an unusual observation. Pritchett kept meticulous records of his farm operations, weather, conditions, and notable events. On November 8th, he wrote, "Saw lights at Holloway Place late at night. Not lanterns moving about, but steady lights in the upper windows, dozens of them, as if for a celebration. But no sounds of gathering, no visitors on the road. Unsettling." Throughout the winter of 1879 and into 1880, these lights were observed repeatedly by the Pritchetts and other neighbors, always in the upstairs windows, always late at night, always accompanied by an eerie silence. When Thomas came to town for supplies in January of 1880, Samuel Pritchett approached him in the general store. According to Pritchett's later testimony, the conversation went as follows. "I asked after his sister, as is customary when inquiring about a man's family. He looked at me with eyes that seemed not quite focused, and he said, 'Margaret is well. She is very well. She is preparing for a great event.' I asked what event he meant, and he smiled, but it was not a natural smile. He said, 'Our union, it has been blessed.' Then he gathered his supplies and left without another word." Pritchett reported this conversation to his wife, who immediately understood the implication. If Margaret was preparing for marriage, why had no young man been seen visiting the property? Why had no announcement been made? Why did Thomas speak of their union? Abigail Pritchett, more socially connected than her husband, began making discreet inquiries among other families in the area. No one had seen Margaret Holloway in months. No one knew of any potential suitor, and Thomas's behavior had become increasingly strange. In March of 1880, a traveling preacher named Reverend Elijah Marsh stopped at the Holloway farm seeking water for his horse. This was a common practice in rural areas, and hospitality was generally expected. But Thomas met him at the gate and would not allow him onto the property. Marsh later described the encounter in a letter to his church superiors. "The man was unkempt, wild-eyed, and there was about him a smell both sweet and corrupt, like flowers left too long in a sealed room. When I asked after his family, he said his wife was resting and could not be disturbed. When I expressed surprise, saying I had heard he was unmarried, he became agitated and insisted he had been married for months. He spoke of his wife with a devotion that bordered on mania, saying she was perfect and unchanging, and that their love was eternal in the truest sense. I left quickly, feeling that I had encountered either madness or something darker still. Tell me in the comments what you think is happening so far. Based on what you've heard, what do you believe Thomas has done? And more importantly, why do you think no one intervened sooner?" By the summer of 1880, the situation had taken on an even more disturbing dimension. Children playing in the woods near the Holloway property reported hearing a woman singing. The voice came from the upper windows of the house, a high, clear voice, singing what sounded like hymns or lullabies. But when adults investigated, the singing would stop, and Thomas would appear at the window, staring out at them until they left. Was Margaret actually alive? Had the reports of her illness been exaggerated, or was something more sinister occurring? In September of 1880, a violent storm damaged part of the Holloway property's boundary fence. Samuel Pritchett, being a good neighbor, went to inform Thomas of the damage so it could be repaired before livestock wandered onto the property. He arrived in the late afternoon and knocked on the door repeatedly without answer. Knowing Thomas was home because smoke rose from the chimney, Pritchett walked around to the back of the house. What he saw through a ground-floor window shook him profoundly. The interior of the house was in a state of decay. Furniture was draped with sheets. Dust covered everything. But on a table in what had once been the dining room, fresh flowers sat in a vase, and beside them a woman's hand mirror, hairbrush, and various cosmetics were neatly arranged. More disturbingly, Pritchett heard Thomas's voice from upstairs, speaking softly, lovingly, as if in conversation. But no second voice replied. There was only Thomas, speaking into silence, pausing as if listening to responses that were not there. Pritchett left immediately and did not return. Over the following months and years, the Holloway farm became a source of local legend. Parents warned children to stay away. Travelers who passed on the road reported an overwhelming sense of wrongness, a feeling that the property itself was somehow cursed. And still, Thomas Holloway continued his routine. Once every few months he would come to town for supplies. He would purchase not only food and necessities, but also candles in large quantities, lamp oil, various chemicals whose purpose was unclear, and fabrics, always white fabrics. The town's general storekeeper, Marcus Finch, kept a record of these purchases. In his later testimony, he noted that Thomas always paid in cash, never spoke beyond what was necessary, and always asked after the availability of preserving agents, such as salt, alcohol, and various herbs. When questioned about why he needed such items, Thomas would say only that he was maintaining something precious. In 1882, 3 years after Margaret's death, a young physician named Dr. Robert Chandler arrived in the area to establish a practice. Chandler, fresh from medical school in Philadelphia, was curious about the local legends surrounding the Holloway farm. He convinced Samuel Pritchett to accompany him to the property under the pretense of offering free medical services to the reclusive siblings. Thomas met them at the gate as always and refused them entry. But Dr. Chandler, trained in observation, noted several things that he later documented in his private journal. Thomas's clothing, though old, was clean. His hair was combed. He wore a wedding ring that had not been visible in previous encounters. And most tellingly, when the wind shifted, Chandler detected an odor that he recognized from his anatomical studies. The smell of preserving chemicals mixed with organic decay. "I am convinced," Chandler wrote in his journal, "that something dead is being kept in that house. And I am further convinced that Thomas Holloway has lost his grip on reality to such a degree that he may not even recognize that his sister has died. Or, worse, he recognizes it and has decided that death is not an impediment to whatever relationship they shared." But Dr. Chandler did not report his suspicions to the authorities. In 1880s rural Georgia, a man's property was his own, and unless clear evidence of a crime existed, no one had the right to violate his privacy. Suspicions and bad smells were not enough to warrant legal intervention. And so the years passed. 1883, 1884, 1885. The lights continued to burn in the upstairs windows. Thomas continued his solitary trips to town, and Margaret Holloway officially remained missing, her absence never formally reported, her death never recorded. Until the spring of 1886, when someone finally decided that the truth, whatever it might be, needed to be exposed. On April 14, 1886, Sheriff Coleman Wade received the anonymous letter that would finally bring the truth into the light. The letter's author has never been definitively identified, though handwriting experts later suggested it might have been written by Abigail Pritchett, who had expressed concern about the situation for years. The letter was simple but compelling. The Holloway farm, the locked room upstairs. God have mercy on us all. Wade had heard the rumors, as everyone in the county had, but rumors were not evidence, and he had been reluctant to intrude on a man's property without cause. However, the letter mentioned a locked room, which suggested the writer had specific knowledge of something concealed inside the house. This was enough to justify an investigation. Wade assembled 3 deputies, James Corbin, Michael O'Reilly, and Thomas Garrett, no relation to the Holloways. All 3 men were experienced lawmen who had served during the war. They had seen death and horror. They believed themselves prepared for whatever they might find. They were wrong. The group arrived at the Holloway farm at approximately 9 o'clock in the morning. The property looked even more decrepit than reports had suggested. The once white paint of the house had turned grey. Weeds grew tall around the foundation. The gate hung crooked on its hinges. Thomas Holloway emerged from the house before they even reached the door. He wore a dark suit that looked to be decades old, carefully brushed but worn thin in places. His face was gaunt, his eyes deeply shadowed, but he was calm, almost serene. "I've been expecting someone," he said quietly. "I knew it couldn't last forever." Sheriff Wade explained that they needed to search the property based on information they had received. Thomas did not ask what information. He did not protest or demand a warrant. He simply stepped aside and said, "She's upstairs. Please be respectful. She's been preparing for so long." The deputies exchanged glances. Wade drew his pistol, not knowing what to expect. The interior of the house was dim, curtains drawn against the daylight. The smell that had been noticed from outside was much stronger here, a cloying sweetness mixed with chemical sharpness, and underneath it all, the unmistakable scent of decay. The ground floor was largely abandoned. Furniture sat under dusty sheets. The kitchen showed evidence of minimal use, just enough to keep one person alive. Dishes were stacked neatly. A single place setting sat on a small table, but the stairs leading to the second floor were different. They had been recently swept. Candle wax dripped down the banister, and at the top of the stairs, one door stood closed, unlike all the others, which hung open to reveal empty, unused rooms. This was the locked room. Thomas had followed them upstairs, and now he moved forward to open the door himself. His hand trembled as he reached for the handle. "Please understand," he said, his voice breaking. "I loved her. I love her still. Death is only a word. Love is eternal." He opened the door. The room beyond was a shrine, a bridal chamber, and a tomb all at once. White fabric covered the walls, yellowed with age but carefully maintained. Dozens of candles sat on every available surface, their wax pooled and hardened from years of burning. Dried flowers, some fresh, some ancient, were arranged in vases and scattered across the floor, and on the bed, arranged as if merely sleeping, lay Margaret Holloway. She wore a wedding dress of white silk, now yellowed but intact. Her hands were folded across her chest, holding a bouquet of dried roses. Her hair, still dark, was spread across the pillow. Her face, though sunken and discolored, was surprisingly preserved, the features still recognizable as human. Deputy Corbin vomited immediately. Deputy O'Reilly crossed himself and began praying in Irish. Deputy Garrett simply stood frozen, unable to process what he was seeing. Sheriff Wade, forcing himself to remain professional, moved closer to examine the body. It was immediately clear that Margaret had been dead for years. The body showed signs of natural mummification, aided by chemical preservation. The skin was darkened and leathery in places, but there was no active decomposition. Thomas had managed, through some combination of chemicals, desiccation, and the dry air of the room, to prevent the complete decay of his sister's corpse. But the preservation itself was not the most disturbing aspect of the scene. Around the bed, papers were arranged in careful order, drawings, writings, symbols that appeared to be either religious or occult in nature. And on the wall above the bed, written in what appeared to be dried blood, was a single phrase in Latin, Mors non est finis amoris. Death is not the end of love. As Sheriff Wade and his deputies struggled to process the horror of the locked room, Thomas remained eerily calm. He sat on the floor in the hallway, his back against the wall, and spoke without prompting. "I married her," he said. 2 weeks after she died, I married her. I had a ring made. I wrote vows. I spoke them over her, and in my heart, I heard her speak them back to me. We are husband and wife before God, before nature, before whatever powers exist beyond this world. Wade asked where the rest of Margaret's belongings were. Thomas led them to an adjoining room, smaller than the bridal chamber, which he called her study. This room was filled with journals, dozens of them, spanning years. Some were clearly written by Margaret during her lifetime. Others were written by Thomas after her death. And some, disturbingly, were written by Thomas in Margaret's name, as if channeling her voice. The journals from Margaret's lifetime revealed a deeply troubled young woman, isolated and lonely, who had developed feelings for her brother that she recognized as sinful but could not suppress. One entry from 1877 reads, "I know this love is wrong. I know God condemns it. But Thomas is all I have in this world. He is my brother, my friend, my only companion. When he looks at me, I see something I cannot name, and I know he feels as I do. We have never spoken of it, but it exists between us like a living thing." Another entry from 1879, shortly before her death. "I am ill, and I fear I will not recover. Thomas tends to me with such devotion that I weep from the purity of it. He has promised me that if I die, he will not let me go into the darkness alone. I do not know what he means, but his promise comforts me." The journals written by Thomas after her death are progressively more disturbing. The early entries show a man in profound grief, unable to accept the loss. October 15th, 1879. "I have prepared her. She looks peaceful, as if sleeping. I cannot bear to put her in the ground. I cannot bear to let the earth take her from me. I will keep her here, where I can see her, where I can speak to her. Death has not changed my love. Death has not changed anything." But as the months passed, Thomas's writings became less coherent. He began to describe conversations with Margaret's spirit. He recorded dreams where she came to him and told him what to do. He documented rituals he performed, mixing Christian prayer with folk magic and what appeared to be practices derived from books on mesmerism and spiritualism. November 1st, 1879. "I have married her. The ceremony was beautiful. I know she was present. I felt her spirit beside me as I spoke the vows. She is my wife now, in death as she could not be in life. Society would condemn us, but society does not understand the nature of true love. Our love transcends the flesh. Our love is eternal." The journals from 1880 onward document Thomas's increasing belief that he could bring Margaret back to life. He researched preservation techniques. He studied ancient texts on resurrection. He convinced himself that through proper care, through devotion, through ritual, he could restore her. "She is not truly dead," he wrote in 1881. "Death is only a transition. The body is a vessel, and the vessel can be maintained until the spirit is ready to return. I perform the rituals nightly. I speak her name. I call to her across the veil, and I know that she hears me." By 1885, his writings had become nearly illegible, filled with symbols and phrases in Latin, Greek, and languages no one could identify. He described visions, voices, and the presence of entities that were neither living nor dead. The final entry, dated April 10th, 1886, just 4 days before the discovery, reads, "They are coming. I have known this for some time. The world will not allow us to remain as we are, but it does not matter. We have had our time. We have been husband and wife in the truest sense. When they take me, I will go to her. Nothing can separate us now, not death, not law, not God himself. While the diaries provided insight into Thomas's mental state, it was the physical evidence in the bridal chamber that revealed the full extent of his actions over the 7 years since Margaret's death. Dr. Leonard Hartwell, a physician and amateur forensic scientist from Savannah, was called to examine the body and the room. His report, filed with the county on April 20, 1886, remains one of the most detailed descriptions of the case. Margaret's body had been preserved through a combination of methods. Thomas had apparently researched embalming techniques and had applied various chemicals to slow decomposition. Salt, alcohol, aromatic oils, and herbs had been used extensively. The room's windows had been sealed to prevent humidity. A small coal stove had been used to keep the air dry and warm. The result was partial mummification. Margaret's body was not fully preserved, but it had not completely decomposed either. She existed in a state between recognizable but clearly dead, a monument to Thomas's refusal to accept reality. Dr. Hartwell's examination revealed that Margaret had indeed died of natural causes, likely typhoid fever, as Thomas had described in his journals. There was no evidence of violence or foul play in her death itself. However, what Thomas had done after her death was unprecedented. He had dressed her in wedding attire. He had positioned her body as if sleeping. He had arranged her hands, applied cosmetics to her face, and maintained her hair. Each week, according to his journals, he would enter the room, speak to her, read to her, and perform what he called renewal rituals, involving the reapplication of preserving agents. Most disturbingly, evidence suggested that Thomas had, on multiple occasions, removed Margaret from the bed to move her to different positions in the room. Marks on the floor indicated where a chair had been placed, and journal entries described taking meals together and sitting by the window watching the sunset. The wedding ring that Thomas wore matched a ring found on Margaret's skeletal finger. Both rings were inscribed with the date November 1st, 1879, and the phrase "Eternum vinculum," eternal bond. Sheriff Wade ordered the room photographed, a relatively new practice in criminal investigation. These photographs, now held in the Georgia State Archives, show the room in all its macabre detail. They remain difficult to view even today, more than a century later. Thomas Holloway was arrested on April 14, 1886, and taken into custody. He did not resist. He did not speak beyond repeating, "She was my wife. I honored her. I loved her." He was held in the county jail while officials determined what charges to file. The situation was unprecedented. Margaret had died of natural causes, so there was no murder charge. But desecration of a corpse, failure to report a death, fraud, claiming to be married when no legal marriage existed, and various other charges were considered. However, before formal charges could be filed, Thomas Holloway vanished. On the night of April 18, 1886, 4 days after his arrest, Thomas was found missing from his cell. The door was still locked from the outside. The window bars were intact. No one had heard or seen anything unusual. To this day, no one knows how Thomas Holloway escaped from that cell or what became of him afterward. His body was never found. No one reported seeing him. He simply disappeared, as completely as if he had never existed. The only clue was found in his cell the next morning, scratched into the wall above his cot, in the same handwriting that filled his journals, was a single sentence: "I go to where she waits." The discovery at the Holloway farm shocked the nation. Newspapers from New York to San Francisco carried the story, often with lurid headlines: "Brother weds sister's corpse," "Georgia horror," "7 years with the dead," "The flesh marriage of Chatham County." But the immediate scandal was only the beginning of the story. In the decades that followed, new information continued to emerge, each piece adding depth to the tragedy and mystery of Thomas and Margaret Holloway. In 1892, Dr. William James, the pioneering psychologist from Harvard, traveled to Georgia to investigate the case. James was interested in extreme psychological states and believed the Holloway case represented a unique intersection of grief, delusion, and what he called morbid devotion. James interviewed everyone still living who had known the Holloways or had been involved in the investigation. He examined the journals that had been preserved in county records. His analysis, published in a limited circulation medical journal in 1894, concluded that Thomas had suffered from a rare delusional disorder exacerbated by profound isolation and complicated grief. But James also noted something that troubled him: the consistency of Thomas's delusions and the apparent sophistication of his preservation techniques. This was not, James wrote, the work of a simple-minded madman. Thomas Holloway possessed considerable intelligence and resourcefulness. The fact that he managed to maintain his sister's body in a relatively preserved state for 7 years suggests research, planning, and an understanding of chemical and environmental factors that would be unusual even among medical professionals of the time. Where had Thomas learned these techniques? His journals mentioned ancient texts and forbidden knowledge, but no such books were found in the house. This led to speculation that Thomas had made trips to larger cities to access libraries and bookshops, researching in secret while maintaining the appearance of complete isolation. In 1923, Samuel Pritchett, now an elderly man, gave his final interview to a local historian, compiling records of unusual events in Georgia history. Pritchett, knowing he was near death, decided to reveal something he had kept secret for decades. "I knew," he said. "I knew Margaret was dead. I had seen them together before her illness, in ways that siblings should not be. I had heard Thomas speaking to silence in that house. And when she disappeared, I knew she had not left, that she was still there. But I said nothing. We all said nothing. Because in our hearts, we believed that whatever sin they had committed, they had already been punished enough. We let it continue because we did not want the scandal, the shame, the reminder that such things could happen among us." Pritchett's confession revealed that the community's inaction was not ignorance, but a collective choice to look away from something they found too disturbing to confront. This raises uncomfortable questions about how many people enabled Thomas's delusions through their silence. By the 1950s, the Holloway house had stood abandoned for 70 years. The property had reverted to the state when no heir came forward to claim it. Local teenagers, drawn by the legends, would occasionally dare each other to enter the decaying building. In 1956, a group of high school students from Savannah spent the night in the house as a test of courage. One of them, Robert Tillman, later became a journalist and wrote extensively about the experience. According to Tillman's account, the group had set up camp in what had been the parlor on the ground floor. Around midnight, they heard footsteps on the stairs. Thinking it was one of their group playing a prank, they called out. No one answered. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, moving along the upstairs hallway. When they went to investigate with their flashlights, they found the hallway empty. But the door to the bridal chamber, which had been nailed shut by authorities in 1886, was standing open. Inside the room, though stripped of its contents decades earlier, the smell remained. That sweet chemical smell mixed with decay. And on the wall where Thomas had written, "Mors non est finis amoris," the words were still faintly visible, though they should have faded completely by then. More unsettling was what Tillman described as a presence, a feeling that someone was watching us, waiting for us to leave so they could return to something we had interrupted. The group fled and never returned. Tillman's account was published in a regional magazine in 1958, reigniting interest in the case and prompting new investigations. In 1974, a team of archaeologists from the University of Georgia conducted a survey of historical sites in Chatham County. The Holloway property was included as a site of historical interest due to its connection to the notorious case. During excavation of the grounds, the team made several discoveries. First, they found the family cemetery, which contained the graves of Jeremiah and Clara Holloway, along with 2 infant children. But they also found a 6th grave, unmarked and positioned slightly outside the cemetery's iron fence. Carbon dating and forensic analysis suggested the burial had occurred sometime in the late 1880s or early 1890s. The grave contained the remains of a male, approximately 35 to 40 years old at time of death. DNA testing was not yet available in 1974, so definitive identification was impossible. But the archaeological team noted something peculiar. The body had been buried with a woman's wedding ring clutched in its right hand. The inscription inside the ring read, "Eternum vinculum." It was Margaret's ring, the one that had been on her hand when her body was discovered in 1886. The official report concluded, while definitive proof is impossible without modern DNA analysis, it is highly probable that this grave contains the remains of Thomas Holloway. The presence of Margaret's wedding ring suggests he returned to the property after his escape and died here, on the land where he and his sister had lived their forbidden love. If this conclusion is correct, it means Thomas never fled far. He came back, he came home, and he died within sight of the house where Margaret's body had been kept for 7 years. But questions remain. Who buried him? How did he obtain Margaret's ring, which should have been in evidence custody? And most mysteriously, why was he buried outside the family cemetery, as if even in death he was considered an outsider, someone who did not belong with the respectable dead? In 1982, a private collection of letters belonging to the family of Dr. Robert Chandler, the young physician who had suspected something wrong at the Holloway farm, was donated to the Georgia Historical Society. Among these letters was a sealed envelope marked "to be opened only after my death" and dated 1920. When the envelope was finally opened, it contained a letter from Dr. Chandler describing an encounter he had never reported publicly. In the summer of 1887, more than a year after Thomas's disappearance, Chandler had been called to examine a patient in a rural area near the Florida border. While traveling through a small settlement, he encountered a man who bore a striking resemblance to Thomas Holloway. The man was working as a laborer, using a different name, and appeared to be living quietly and anonymously. Chandler wrote, "I recognized him immediately, though he was much changed. Thinner, older, with an air of profound exhaustion about him. Our eyes met for only a moment. He knew that I knew. I saw in his face a plea for mercy, a silent request that I say nothing, and I honored that request. Whatever crimes he had committed, whatever madness had consumed him, I believed he had suffered enough. I let him disappear into his new life and never spoke of it to anyone." If Chandler's account is accurate, it means Thomas did escape and lived for at least a year after his disappearance. But it also means he eventually returned to Georgia, to the property, where he died and was buried in that unmarked grave. Why would he return? The answer may lie in the final pages of his journals, where he wrote repeatedly about promises and vows that bound him to that place, to Margaret forever. The Holloway property remains undeveloped to this day. Several attempts have been made over the decades to build on the land, but each project has been abandoned due to what developers describe as unusual difficulties. In 2003, a construction crew hired to clear the lot for a housing development refused to continue work after 3 days. The foreman, Miguel Santos, told local news, "The equipment kept malfunctioning. We'd hear voices when no one was there. And the smell, that sweet, sick smell, it would come and go with no explanation. My crew was terrified. We left, and we're not going back. Local paranormal investigation groups have visited the ruins multiple times. While skeptics dismiss their findings as wishful thinking and confirmation bias, the investigators consistently report similar phenomena. EVP recordings that seem to contain whispered words in old-fashioned speech patterns, temperature anomalies in the area where the house once stood, and the persistent smell that so many have described over the decades. Most compellingly, several investigators have reported hearing what sounds like a wedding ceremony being conducted. A male voice, speaking vows, pausing, then continuing as if receiving responses that the living cannot hear. In 2019, a team from Savannah College of Art and Design conducted an overnight investigation with multiple cameras and audio recording devices. Their footage, available on various video platforms, shows several unexplained anomalies, including what appears to be candlelight visible in the air where the second-floor bridal chamber would have been, despite the house having been demolished in 1962. Whether these phenomena represent genuine paranormal activity, environmental factors creating suggestible conditions, or simply the power of a tragic story to affect human perception remains a matter of debate. But for those who have spent time on the property, especially at night, the feeling is undeniable. Something lingers there, something that refuses to let go. We have traveled through more than a century of mystery, following the trail of Thomas and Margaret Holloway from their isolated life, together through death, obsession, and whatever lies beyond. The question that haunts this case is not simply what happened, but why it continues to resonate so deeply with those who encounter it. Perhaps it is because the Holloway case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of love, grief, and sanity. Thomas Holloway loved his sister in a way that society condemned. When she died, he could not accept the finality of that loss. His actions were horrifying, but they came from a place of profound emotional pain. Are we looking at the story of a monster, or the story of a human being broken by circumstances and forbidden feelings he could not control? Several theories have emerged over the decades to explain the Holloway case. Theory 1: isolated madness. Thomas Holloway was a man driven insane by isolation, grief, and an incestuous relationship that filled him with guilt. His preservation of Margaret's body and the elaborate rituals were manifestations of a complete psychological break from reality. His escape from jail was simply a matter of bribing a guard or exploiting a security lapse, and he died shortly after, probably by his own hand, unable to live with what he had done. Theory 2: supernatural influence. Some believe that Thomas's journals revealed genuine contact with forces beyond the natural world. His knowledge of preservation techniques, his elaborate rituals, and the phenomena reported at the property for more than a century suggest that something genuinely paranormal was involved. According to this theory, Thomas did not escape from his cell. He was taken, transported by the same forces he had invoked to wherever Margaret's spirit resided. Theory 3: communal guilt. This theory, popular among sociologists studying the case, suggests that the community's failure to intervene earlier was not just passive neglect, but active complicity. By allowing Thomas to continue his obsession for 7 years, the community enabled his descent into complete madness. The persistent legends and phenomena at the property represent not supernatural haunting, but collective psychological guilt manifesting across generations. What we know for certain is limited. Margaret Holloway died in 1879 of natural causes. Her brother Thomas kept her body in their home for 7 years, believing they were married, speaking to her as if she were alive, and performing rituals intended to preserve her or restore her to life. When discovered, he was arrested, then mysteriously disappeared. A body believed to be his was found buried on the property decades later, and the site continues to affect people who visit it, whether through genuine paranormal activity or the psychological power of knowing what occurred there. But the deeper questions remain unanswered. Did Thomas truly believe Margaret could return, or was his preservation of her body a desperate attempt to freeze time, to hold on to the only love he had ever known? When he disappeared from his jail cell, did he escape to live a quiet, anonymous life as Dr. Chandler suggested, or did something else occur? And most mysteriously, why does the story refuse to end, continuing to generate experiences and encounters more than 140 years after Margaret's death? To this day, no one knows the complete truth of what transpired at the Holloway farm between 1879 and 1886. We have journals, physical evidence, testimonies, and theories. But the inner life of Thomas Holloway, the true nature of his relationship with his sister, and what he believed he was accomplishing through his rituals, remain mysteries that may never be fully solved. The ruins of the Holloway property still stand in Chatham County, Georgia. The land is still undeveloped. And on certain nights, according to locals, if you stand quietly among the oak trees draped with Spanish moss, you can still smell it. That sweet, chemical smell. The smell of flowers and preservation and decay. And if you listen very carefully, some say you can hear whispered words carried on the wind. Words that sound like vows being spoken, promises being made, a ceremony that has never ended. Mors non est finis amoris. Death is not the end of love. For Thomas and Margaret Holloway, perhaps it never was. Before you go, I want to hear from you. What do you believe really happened? Was this madness, love, or something darker? Do you think Thomas escaped and lived a quiet life, or did something supernatural occur? And most importantly, would you have the courage to spend a night at the ruins of the Holloway farm? Leave your theories in the comments below. This community thrives on your thoughts and perspectives, and I read every single one. If this story has disturbed you, fascinated you, or made you think about the boundaries between love and obsession, please consider subscribing to this channel and hitting that notification bell. We explore the darkest corners of history, the stories that are too disturbing to forget and too compelling to ignore. Share this video with someone who loves true crime, horror history, and mysteries that have no easy answers. Our haunted community grows stronger with each person who joins us on these journeys into darkness. Until next time, remember, the past never truly dies. It lingers in old houses, in family secrets, in love that refuses to accept the finality of death. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and always ask the questions that others are afraid to voice. I'll see you in the next investigation.